Everybody dancing just like I tell you. And when I say hold yourself, I want all of you get ready to stop. When I say stop, don't move. And when I say get it, I want all of y'all to go. Hold it now. Boogie woogie. Stop.
Okay, hello everybody.
Hey.
Hello internet. Welcome to Discover RPG. That chat show we do on Wednesdays where we take your questions about D&D and RPGs and substitute them with our own and then try to finish our planned topics. We have a delightful guest host today with me, Matthew Seibert, one of our Nerdsmith family. Hi, Matthew.
Hello, Angela, and hello, chat room.
How are you doing today?
I'm doing all right. Yeah, little stressed as something coming up a bit later. I'm not sure when we want to announce that.
Oh, we can talk about it right now. Matthew
All right,
Seibert is one of our awesome creators here on Nerdsmith, and more importantly, he has a premiere today. Do you want to talk about what show is premiering and when people can find it?
I would absolutely want to talk about that. Thank you, Angela. Well, 5 p.m. Pacific time tonight. That's 7 Central, 8 Eastern. We are premiering a brand new show right here on this Twitch channel, and that is called Homebrew Studio. And basically, for about an hour, I'm going to be interacting with whoever happens to be in the chat room, and we are going to be creating some interesting, unique homebrew creation for RPGs, probably mostly D&D 5e, but we will branch out into other systems as well. And it's just a series to help new dungeon masters, new game masters, people who are interested in designing their own homebrew content, teaching them how to do it, helping them come up with creative ideas, and just designing fun things that people can use in their own games at home.
I'm so excited. I'm very, very much looking forward to it. So we have Matthew today. Logan is out for another week, but he will be back soon, and thank you, Matthew, so much for subbing in, because we would love to make sure that our viewers can meet you and hopefully follow us over to Homebrew Studio when you guys launch tonight. It's very exciting. Okay, so how about we go over our session plan for today? We'll get back to witty banter, or I suppose it says playful banter, but you know, I like to think it's witty too. But that might be very subjective of me. All right, so our session plan for today, we're going to talk about a bunch of really fun stuff. First, we're going to get to know Matt a little bit more, where his background is with RPGs and role-playing and that sort of thing. That'll be our guest. Then we're going to transition a little bit into a topic that Matthew suggested, which was the devil you know, playing evil characters or figuring out how to play copacetically in a group when you're choosing to play an evil aligned character instead of just, you know, setting the house on fire. What could you do to work with your party? Then we're going to cover a fun announcement in the WotC community. The Artificer was revisited and re-released as Unearthed Arcana. So we're going to take a look at the class and see what we think about it. Then Taming of the Brew, we are continuing with our Artificer theme, and we're going to look at Tools of the Trade, which is an Artificer subclass document that was made. There's a lot of really fun variations on this idea of a specialist that maybe leans a little bit more towards the technical side of magic. Then we're going to talk about timescales, how you approach time in a campaign or maybe just across sessions. What are some ways you can think differently about, you know, one session is just here's the day, and then the next session is, okay, how much time might pass? So we'll talk about that idea of how to utilize timescales for interesting effect. And then scientific methods, we're going to talk about, we always play around in fantasy here when we talk about D&D, but what happens if we want to start incorporating science and technology into those settings? What are some fun ways to do that? It kind of plays into the Artificer very nicely. And so we'll talk about what we think about science in fantasy and perhaps in other genres we can talk about. All right. So Matthew, we met in an earlier project.
Yes, we did. What has it been 2 years now since
Probably since it started.
Machina,
sure.
an Exandrian musical.
Matthew was in our crew, or was in our cast for the Vox Machina Hamilton musical that the Cantata Pansophical did. So
you can hear me as Earthbreaker Groon using a very poor quality mic that I had at the time.
But you were wonderful. I very much appreciate that whole song is wonderful, and you did a great job. But yeah, so what was let's go back. Let's roll back the clock, even before the cantata. What was little Matthew? That was a sign that broke in my room. Everything's fine. See, the time travel just disrupted. It was just a wave of timey-wimey stuff. Okay, so what got you interested in role-playing games? Like, where did you start off playing RPGs?
I mean, the earliest experience was probably back in the Halcyon days of like 97-ish, doing like play-by-post RPGs on bulletin boards.
Kindred spirit here. We have a bunch of people that come in that are like, forums, text forums,
forums.
Cool.
And I mean, that was sort of the genesis in it. I didn't get into tabletop role-playing games like Dungeons & Dragons till pretty recent. But once I did, I was like, so much fun! I get to create this character and play them and inhabit them on these crazy adventures, and it's been so great. So yeah.
Did you like? Were you into drama or anything as a kid? That was the role playing and improv was appealing.
I did some drama in middle school, high school, that kind of stuff. So yeah, that was already part of it.
Cool. Awesome. So do you just have a background in D&D, or are there other systems that you enjoy playing?
I've dabbled in some other systems, the Powered by the Apocalypse system, Dungeon World, and Tremulous specifically. Tremulous, probably most people haven't heard of, but it's a sort of Lovecraftian horror take on the Powered by the Apocalypse system, which I think is a lot of fun. And Call of Cthulhu, a little bit of the Cypher system in Numenera. Okay. A little bit of Pathfinder.
Okay, so you got your toes in a couple of different ponds. So, and you said before we started, you mentioned like one-page RPGs. Have you played around with a few of those before in the past, or just?
I've never actually done a one-page RPG before.
Well,
so
that will be
in the near future.
Have fun.
Thank you. Oh, and Fiasco, of course.
Oh, heck yeah. Yeah, the little red binder on my bookshelf is my Fiasco printed, because I bought the PDFs. It's full of dice. There's a bag of dice in it. That's where all my red dice are. I'm like, where are all my red dice? And they're all in that bag. Yeah, I had a ton of fun playing Fiasco. I've only got to play it a couple times just because I haven't gotten a lot of chance to do in-person play, and the dice on the table is just really, really fun to have as as sort of a prop. But yeah, we played dickish time travelers.
Okay.
We were terrible people, and one of my friends played my grandpa, and he was an awful person.
Yeah, I think my favorite Fiasco game was at a convention. We were playing a superhero Fiasco. I was
very cool.
I was the arch nemesis of the superhero, and we had some weird sexual tension going on between us. It was great.
I've been meaning to play Everyone is Batman. That's a really good Fiasco setting, where everyone is just a different iteration of Batman.
Nice.
There have been some really interesting ones. I really like the Dresden Files Fate game, RPG, and there's a Dresden Files Fiasco playset where you're all playing villains trying to do a heist, and the turn in that version is just Harry Dresden shows up. So, like, he's the chaotic insert into the storyline that messes everybody's plans up. It's quite amusing. Well, how about this? Speaking of evil, this feels like a very good segue. I'm going to take advantage. So, We all like playing characters that have varying degrees of being kind of garbage people. There's always, you want drama, you want conflict in your characters. But I think a lot of people, for the most part, enjoy getting along or having similar goals with their party members. So the decision to perhaps play an evil character, and we can talk about all evil parties, and we can talk about being sort of a odd man out kind of. But what are your thoughts? You seem relatively pro attempting to play an evil character. Do you have like an anecdote for a particular campaign you enjoyed playing a?
Well, yeah, I can kind of tell this story, and I think this is a topic you and Logan have touched on in the past, but I have like my own personal experience with it. I've never played in a full evil party, and I almost think that playing a full evil party would be more disorganized and disruptive than just having a single evil character in your party. Because evil is kind of all about, I have my goals and I'm going to do my thing and screw everybody else. And if you have 4 people all in that mindset, I can see it going haywire really quickly, unless it was all like, we are 4 evil disciples of the same evil overlord and our interests align.
Sure.
But the campaign I played in, which this was a 2-year campaign I played with 4 of my very best friends, we had a party that consisted of 2 chaotic good characters, a chaotic neutral character, and then my character, who was an undead skeleton cleric who worshipped the god of death and was neutral evil in alignment. And there was some discussion going into the campaign, I think, is where you have to start if you're going to have an evil character in your campaign. And it was kind of understood from the very beginning that this character is going to become a villain at some point. Like, we may have an alignment of interests to start off with, at least, in that we're all just sort of trying to get by. We're level 1 adventurers. You know, we don't have big stakes in anything just yet. We're just getting our footing. But the day is going to come where there's going to be a reckoning. And when that happens, like, I was completely fine with that and understanding that, okay, when that day comes, this character is no longer mine. I hand it over to the GM, and then it becomes an NPC, and I pick up a new character, which is what ended up happening. But it was great because at that point, we had gone through over half the campaign together, and we formed these close bonds of friendship? Fellowship is probably the better word.
There you go. Convenient fellowship.
Yeah. So when there was that turn, and there was that moment where the road split, and my character went off in one direction and everyone else went off on another, it became a powerful, dramatic moment. Because suddenly, this character who had been an ally to the party and knew everyone so well and so intimately and knew their, like, all of this personal stuff about them, suddenly became an antagonist. Mm-hmm. And that introduced a lot of very interesting complications to the narrative and to the drama of the situation. To the point where when we were getting to the end of the campaign, my character had actually allied with another one of the big bads of the campaign and passed on some delicate personal information about the party to that big bad, which basically meant that the people that the party members were close to were suddenly targets. And it was just it's a great way of introducing dramatic tension, I think, to have that kind of turncoat moment in a campaign. But it's something that, again, you have to discuss, and everyone has to be on the same page from the get-out that this is an evil character, and at some point, it's almost certain that there's going to be a betrayal of some kind. It's not something you want to just drop on people unexpected, because then I think you might get some hurt feelings and
we probably Logan's got a little bit more experience with a turncoat than I do, but that's definitely a topic that I think we should explore more here on the show, is that idea of the turn, or a not just PvP, but a character intended to backstab the party or intended to eventually change sides. And what did you guys do? You talked about like sort of bringing it up out of the blue can be very hurtful or disruptive. What sort of prep did you see happening to prepare the rest of the party to not have that suddenly come out of the blue? Was it just the fact that he was an evil cleric and it was kind of obvious he'd eventually go bad?
I think that was a large part of it, is just being very honest and upfront and very open about the fact that, and it was constantly coming up over the course of the campaign where it was clear this is an evil character, and he will do things that maybe people have moral quandaries with, and we'd end up discussing it as a party, and sometimes he'd be shamed into saying, okay, I won't do that anymore. And
I just felt like a skeleton doing the Charlie Brown sad walk. That's what I'm imagining.
It happened a couple times. Like there was an instance where we had an interaction with a unicorn, and it was a good aligned celestial unicorn, and I'm playing this evil cleric, and I got into trouble with the party because I cast blindness on the unicorn and wanted to kill it, and the party was like, "No, you stop right now!" And so we wound up leaving and didn't kill the unicorn.
I've got a couple of... we've played around with the idea of evil, but we've been in this Countless Heroes campaign for so long that it's like hard to introduce a new one like that. But my husband Andy, he was playing around with this idea of playing a paladin, but flipping what the Oathbreaker means. The idea was an evil paladin that decided they wanted to be good. And so you have a character who... their moral compass is incredibly skewed, but they're just trying really hard to be a good person. But they keep messing up and they keep not understanding. So they've got sort of a juvenile understanding of morality, and they need to be corrected. It's not coming from this place of horrible, like, everything they try to do that's good is like slightly off kilter. So it's like, in the right hands, that could be an incredibly charming character. I think playing evil really depends on that delicate balance of it would work well in maybe a more lighthearted campaign if your definition of evil is maybe a little more lighthearted. Yeah, like you said, you really have to be careful with the party makeup and whether or not people have a tendency for high emotional bleed, because and the being overt about the evil is a little bit easier, I think, to digest. The turncoat being a really huge problem comes into play when you as a player have been misleading the party forever, and that enters into just personal deception, and that can really, if someone can't take that lightly, that can really mess up a group dynamic, not just a party dynamic.
And I think it's also important to establish that even though your alignments may clash, you're capable of working together as a group. There can't be this sense that the evil character is always going against what the other players want to do, and they never sort of mesh as a party. Because then the whole premise kind of falls apart, and you're like, why are these four people staying together when they clearly don't like one another?
Yeah, as a DM, I think part of your responsibility with a group with that kind of makeup is to present situations that they can bond over. Things that are not going to be constant moral quandaries that they're going to butt heads over every time. Find a few quests, find a few storylines for them to engage in that are easier for everybody to get on the same page. Something that is clearly an obstacle that no matter what, everybody agrees this person needs to go, or this monster needs to be defeated.
And our DM, to his credit, is my best friend Chris Fairfield. He did a fantastic job early on in the campaign, looking back on it, in presenting us with bad guys who were just... everyone hated them. It doesn't matter what your alignment is. Like, they were... either, like, there was a green dragon that just wanted to kill us all. Alignment didn't enter into that, so we were
kill us all alignment. That's a good alignment.
Exactly. So, sort of, we have to work together or we all die, and that kind of situation.
Raising the stakes to that level, like when everyone's in danger, everyone's going to want to protect themselves. So yeah, that's a decent one.
Yeah.
am toying with this idea for a one shot where this will maybe play into timescales too when we talk about that later. But everybody it's a little tropey. Everyone meets in a jail, and you talk through the however long, let's say like 6 months, you're all in prison together. And you build, like, maybe you start the session building the relationships and who do you hang out with? Who do you talk to? How do you all connect? But you're all kind of shady, terrible people. But there's like one person in the group that's maybe more of a Robin Hood folk hero sort of person. And the premise of that intro is, how does this person convince you to join them and be part of their rebellion? Like, how are you, a very selfish person, convinced to take this on as a flag bearer for this cause? So then you have to sort of, the goal is to do slight mental gymnastics to figure out how to get your all your characters connected and
Sure.
loyal to each other. So I thought that might be fun. Coming up with that definitely needs to be something that you guys talk about on the outset, is what are the ties that bind you? What are the things that you all commit to? And those things need to be at least strong enough to keep you going as a group. You can't just fracture and fall apart the first time something a little conflict creating happens.
Mm-hmm.
There's Logan has a rule with Countless Heroes that you can be morally gray, you can act a fool, but you can't PvP. Like, you can't steal from other people in the party, you can't victimize them in some way. There's like little rules of, the party is sacred. So you can be a little shit, but don't always be a little shit to the people around you. And then that's one for party cohesion, so that you always have someone you trust. You know you can always trust the rogue, even though they have a tendency to steal shit. You know, yet your personal space is sacred. But it also, I think, helps with people, with interacting as players with each other.
Yeah, you've got to have that basic code of conduct that everyone abides by, and that's how groups work. So,
from a more descriptive perspective, what makes the PC evil? Like, in your example, you're a cleric. What did they do or value that made them clearly evil, not just the alignment line in the character sheet?
Sure. To me, the way I interpret good and evil in terms of alignment is basically altruism is good and selfishness is evil. So if you have somebody who is inherently selfish in everything that they do and all of their motivations are based on furthering themselves and their objectives with no concern for others, that's an evil character.
Okay.
If you have a character that is purely altruistic and is always trying to help other people and their motivations and goals are purely based on being selfless, that's a good character. Most people fall in the middle. Most people are neutral in that regard.
Yeah.
But that's how I, in my head, differentiate between the two.
No, that's fair. That's the metric that Logan and I did when we discussed alternative alignment systems. Altruism versus selfishness, or and part of the reason that we switched those terms was to try to help players be a little bit more self-examining and honest with themselves about the motivations of their characters. Because once you throw evil in, there's a lot of people that are like, well, I don't want to be a lich. That's not what my goal is, so I'm not evil. Mm-hmm. So once you change that terminology, you end up having characters that might be like, no, they're kind of out for number one. They're not bad people. Like, they're not like, I don't know. I don't have a good example, but they're not like pillaging. They're not like destroying the livelihoods of people, or they're not actively trying to. They might, but it might be accidental. But yeah, that idea of sort of reconfiguring how you think about the alignment chart so that maybe people do start venturing a little lower on that morality scale. Just making a more nuanced experience of what kind of people are in this party.
Yeah. If you're familiar with the show The Good Place, I don't know if you watch
absolutely.
it, but I think that is a great show for discussions about the philosophy of morality and the fact that they address that your base motivation is important in determining your morality. If you're doing good things, but for selfish reasons, you're not really doing good. You're still being selfish.
Yeah, I think those self-examinations don't have to change how you play your character, but sometimes it can be very useful to figure out what kind of character you might be inadvertently playing. Because we've done things where we have those alternative alignment charts, and not only did we have the players place themselves on the chart, we then had everybody place everybody else on the chart. So we had these little scatter plots of where you were sort of associated. And that was a really interesting thought experiment we did, where it was like, oh, why is there an outlier there? It was interesting to compare. And especially because specifically on Countless, we have 15, 16 players. You had actually some relatively valid data because you had that many people experiencing a character. Jay, those did get finished. I haven't put them out yet, but I will share them. They were only for our first story arc, so characters have since changed and new characters have been brought in, but overall most people either thought it was really, really challenging because they didn't know all the characters enough, or thought it was really, really fun that they were able to go, oh, okay, this is where I would put, this is where I put this person and that person. They really liked I think we had altruism and selfishness, or the others and self. And then we had two maps that they did. The other one, I think, had to do with logic versus emotion, like how they approached that sort of thing. We had tradition versus innovation, I think was one of them. And I don't remember what the last one was, but we had these two charts that you plotted on. So it was a fun little icebreaker midway through the second arc to have them kind of reassess. And yeah, it was really fun. We didn't have a lot of people that ended up on the, like I said, we got rid of the evil thing because nobody would self-identify as evil. But yeah, it was super fun. I really, really enjoyed that. I highly recommend doing that as an exercise with your party sometimes, is just changing what the alignment chart even says and see where you land.
Yeah. Totally agree. And there's a thing that Jay said a little bit earlier in chat, in that it's not just always the evil character that's disruptive to the party. If the good characters all kind of gang up on the evil character and are just from the outright distrustful and don't allow the character to meld into the group, that's also preventing those bonds from forming. So that's important.
So the idea of why do your characters hang out together? Why are they allied? That question needs to not just be posited to the evil character, that needs to be posited to the good characters too. What are a good exercise for that would be, each of you has to go around the group and say one thing you find admirable about one of the other people. So if you have these really deep moral issues with what the characters are doing, you at least are like, well, what is the value I see in this player, or in this, not the player, but the character? That can be very valuable to be like, all right, once we do that, where's the bond form? Where's that connection going to be forged? And you as a DM might need to help them. You might need to start crafting stories that allow them to bond. Once everybody's... go ahead.
I was going to say, look for neutral antagonists that both sides can agree on. This is something we need to fight against. That's important for just building a group in general and getting that sort of group dynamic going. Is because everyone, even if you're of similar alignments, everyone has their own goals, their own ambitions. So giving them that base of this is something we can all come together and stand against is important from the outset. So yeah.
Agreed. I think it's also, and this is just an alternative way of approaching it, when you have people in the party that are of such different moral compasses, it might be useful to maybe explore alternative ways to engage in fantasy. A lot of times in the high fantasies, you've got the ultimate evil versus the ultimate good, and that's where a lot of those motivations are going to start coming into conflict. But if you change the stakes, have it be a more low stakes campaign or game where your focus is very local instead of this overarching high-minded concept of good and evil. You could play it where you all live in a kingdom. You're just trying to protect your territory. Everyone's in agreement that they want things the way they are, even though, somebody has shrunken heads in their bedroom somewhere and the other person's, feeding the homeless. But those people still want their home to stay their home. And that's the way that everybody can connect. You don't necessarily have to all be fighting Vecna and agreeing that Vecna is a bad thing or a thing that shouldn't exist.
Right.
So being mindful as a DM, what kind of stories you can tell with that kind of group.
Sure.
So I don't have any issue intrinsically with playing evil. I think you're right, though. Everyone has to be on the same page. That this is what's happening. I really liked the way that your group went about it, which was, it was very obvious from the get-go that this was a ticking time bomb.
Yeah.
And once everybody's in that mindset, you might be able to have a lot of fun with that, where everybody knows, okay, this is absurd that we have this undead skeleton cleric hanging out with us. Just lean into the absurdity of it.
There was a bit of that as well, yeah.
It speaks to the tone, perhaps, of the game, but then that turn still can be powerful. The understanding how to empathize with your characters and find something dramatic, even when on the surface it might look a little absurd to have this particular party makeup. So bravo! That's a really good example. I like it. It's of course challenging on the flip side. Not everybody's going to be interested in playing with an evil character. So you got to make sure you set expectations with your players. If you have someone really hankering to play an evil character, you might need to set their expectations, because that might not be what the group wants. They might want everybody's on the same page, everyone is a shining beacon of hope.
Sure.
Kind of not simplistic, but a more traditional high fantasy story. So you just be mindful, and like we always say, communication's key. It always comes down to just making sure you talk to people and understand what you want.
And also make sure no one in the party really wants to play the lawful good paladin who smites evil wherever they see it, because that's just a recipe for disaster from the get-go.
And this is campaign talk. If you want to do something chaotic, one-shots are the time to do that, because there's no long-term consequences for your characters when you're only going to be goofing off with them once. So that might be the time to try that dynamic and see if you can run it as a DM, see if your players actually enjoy that sort of dynamic. Is doing it in the certainly more low-stakes environment of a one-shot or a two-shot, something that's very short. So that would be my thing, is try it out, but, manage expectations and keep your time short in case it blows up in your face. Unless you trust everybody. Trust is a really big thing. So
trust is important.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's take a look at our next topic. So people who pay attention to Homebrew, pay attention to Wizards of the Coast, might have noticed that they had promised at the beginning of February that at some point in February they were going to re-release the Artificer. The Artificer class being a sort of science-ish kind of magic user.
We'll get into it.
Yeah. So how about we talk about the basic premise of the Artificer, and then maybe what it was and what it's changed into, if it's changed very substantially in tone.
Okay.
So what do you think about? They call it a Master of Magical Invention. That's sort of the short title for the Artificer.
I feel like they've made a very substantial change in the sort of baseline of what the class is. Because in the original document, it very much seemed like, okay, these are the creators of magical items. Mm-hmm. These are the kind of people that you would go to a magic shop in any given large city, and you'd be purchasing your bags of holding and your potions of flying from this sort of person.
Yeah.
Whereas in this document, they seem to have changed it to be much more almost specific in purpose. Like the artificers in the revisited document seem almost more like these are field medics, these are grenadiers and fighters, and I think that comes more to, I think they're focusing more on Eberron in this setting as opposed to the last one, which was Forgotten Realms, probably.
Yeah. They mention both, or actually, the homebrew we'll talk about contextualizes them in both Forgotten Realms and Eberron. But go ahead.
But yeah, and I think just that sort of change of setting has affected it quite substantially in terms of the way artificers interact with their societies and the kind of artificers you're likely to find.
Sure.
But yeah, it's interesting. I feel like this new build is much more magical, and the last one was much more science-y. And I feel like they've lost a lot of the science in the new one, which I'm not super keen on.
Yeah, the gunsmith's completely gone.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, they have the artillerist, but
even that,
and it looks,
even that the artillery constructs you're making are magical constructs. They just appear because, like casting a spell, you just conjure them and then they disappear when you're done. They aren't mechanical things that you're building and putting together.
I always felt like the only example of mechanical creation were like tinkerer abilities that like the gnome would get. And they talk a little bit about it, and I've seen it expanded on in world building, but yeah, Matt Mercer's gunslinger actually involves the sort of mechanics of it, which I like. So yeah, this definitely is there. I assume they're playing with the expectation that when you're playing an artificer in and of itself makes you think, perhaps, enchantment rather than a more mechanical thing. But I think that might just be the way that it's been used in popular usage. Specifically, I mean, like Tarion in Critical Role was very like he has magic items, so maybe it set a lot of expectation for newer players.
It was, but he also had Dodie. He also had this big robot that was walking around and following him. And robot in arcane terms, but still, yeah. It was the kind of thing that he'd take to a workshop and, like, build guns onto. And it was almost more, approaching like a Warforged or something like that.
Yeah, like a lesser Warforged.
Yeah. Which is no longer in the revisited one. They've completely taken out the... I don't even remember what it was called. I don't think it was called a golem. But
it was a homunculus, was what they were calling it, yeah. They kept it in one of the specialties, or one of the specialist subclasses, is the alchemist has an alchemical homunculus that you can make out of alchemical components. So they kept this idea of basically conjuring a creature.
But it's more of a familiar now, as opposed to a big golem that's going to wade into combat and fight for you.
Agreed. This is a substantial departure from what the original was. And I didn't think the original was perfect. Personally, let me see here. I hadn't actually read through all of the things for the alchemist besides that homunculus feature. Let me see.
Sure. And the homunculus, which... it's a good idea. I think it is very strong. It's like you took the Find Familiar spell and dialed it up to 11. Because it has a ton of hit points. It has all of these special things it can do. It can make people fly. It can give them temporary hit points. It's a very powerful ability. And sort of the artillerist bent on that is the arcane turret, which you also get at 3rd level, and it's kind of like another sort of conjured minion, but it only does one thing, and that is pew 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 pew.
Of different damage types. There is the turret does have a healing shot. Which I always am amused by the idea of shooting people with health. Just makes you think of Overwatch or something. It's like, I'm shooting darts at you. It's a potion. You're
just fire
fine.
syringes with.
You take 1 damage, but you gain 15. It's great. It reminds me a little bit of like the artillers, especially makes me think of more of a like a video game conjuring. It makes me think of like Borderlands or any sort of those where you'd have this turret. I mean, I like that it can move. It's not just a strategically constricting ability. But okay, so the Alchemist Mastery. One of the things that always bothered me is I have now found a homebrew class that does what I wished something called an alchemist would do, giving you something other than the traditional. Here's the list of potions in the DMG. You can make these, and that's it.
Right.
What they've done here is at least opened it up to be reflavored. When they're just saying you use your alchemist supplies as your spellcasting focus. So it's saying that you almost like conjure you could flavor it as I open a bottle and that's part of my alchemist supplies and a thing comes out of it. And so it's basically a potion that does a magical effect. So I at least appreciate they're trying a little bit to get closer to that.
And they kind of, there's a box on page 4 where it talks about the magic of artifice. And it's basically telling you, or giving you kind of ideas of how to flavor all of the spell casting to be more in line with the craftsmanship. And the idea being when you are casting like poison spray, maybe you're like pulling out a vial of something and you throw it and it breaks and it becomes this noxious gas. Yeah. Or if you're like cure wounds, for example, is you putting together a salve and applying it. Like it's flavoring it so that, or giving you options to flavor it so that you're actually like crafting things. And the things you craft create the spell effect rather than you just casting the spell.
Which I appreciate the fact that they're building that flavoring skill into the actual document. That's something that people have done since time immemorial. Is just, all right, well, how do we justify this being something else?
Sure.
I've played with a sorcerer who was like a tech, and she was a scientist, and her cantrips were like she had like I don't remember the name of the cantrip. It's like a fire ray, and she just had a pew pew laser gun that she would bust out and cast that spell. But she had a bunch of things like that. There were just different guns that she had on her, like different devices that she had on her person to justify casting that spell. I like that it's sort of giving you that advice here, where we're going to give you the basic building blocks and you can decide how the tinkering expresses through your spell casting. I do like the idea of, in Cure Wounds, if you're a tinkerer, you might have a miniature mechanical spider that binds your wounds together. It like goes around. I
love that.
It's really fun. Idea. So I do like the fact that they're making it feel a little bit more like or rather it's giving you that little spark of inspiration to build your character like that. And I don't have any issue with a tinkerer artificer like that. It just might take a little bit more. It might just take a little bit more thought than what's verbatim written on the page.
Sure.
Let's see. Are any of these subclasses that you have any opinions on? They have this idea of infusions.
Infusions are interesting. I think it's an interesting idea. It's basically, it's kind of free magic items for the party, especially when one of the abilities is replicate magic item.
Yeah.
And there's a list of magic items that you can just basically create. You are only allowed a certain number dependent on your level, which I think is how they're balancing it.
Yeah.
But it's interesting.
I can see a value in that sort of ability for this class if you were, for example, setting your game in a location that didn't have access to shops.
Sure.
Then your artificer suddenly becomes a vital part of your party. You're not just a utility, like you're the way you guys get magic items when you level. I like the idea that you could just set your adventure in a place that would make your artificer suddenly incredibly valuable.
Yeah.
It does run the risk of being redundant if you set it in a place where that's already an available service, because you're not as proficient as just a shop that has all this stuff already made, ready to go.
Sure.
But that just, just a lot of it is, I think there's a lot of potential in this. I think there is definitely room to have a ton of fun.
Mm-hmm.
I agree that it would be fun. It would be nice to have maybe something slightly more mundane, something that's a little bit more on the tinkering side, than all of it being so heavily reliant on enchantment or having basically a familiar running around. Overall, I think it's at least a nice addition to the class options. It's bridging that gap between something that would be a purely technological based class and like a wizard.
Mm-hmm.
Somewhere in between, and I don't mind having that little nuanced space.
Yeah. I think if I were to take this class and reflavor it,
Mm-hmm.
the way I'd basically do it is take away the concept of spell slots and say, every day you can create this many little tinkering items or this many potions, and each of those potions can have the effect of a spell of this level.
Mm-hmm.
And then that way you're tying in that flavor to the mechanics of the class and saying you're not preparing spells or spending spell slots, you're preparing these items that will replicate spell effect.
Yeah. That makes me think the way that I wished an alchemist would work is, we're potentially, I'm going to be in a show coming up soon where I'm playing a flavored version of a homebrew class that I found. Logan and I had reviewed the gastronome, which is a chef.
Yes.
Yes. I've reflavored it to be a mixologist.
Nice.
But that's exactly what that class does. It says you can make a certain number of your, they're like cantrip level abilities and spell level abilities. You have a certain number based on your constitution modifier that you can make. And those are just out of pocket. You use them. It's basically, you're like a buff spellcaster who has all touch spells. You have to be within 5 feet of the person to be able to give them that ability. But it's also a combination of items. You have a whole list of flavors that you can add to what essentially is a pocket spell that can have like up to 3 spell effects in one go, but you've got a limited number of them. So you can be like, all right, this one gives you a bonus to your AC, and you don't provoke opportunity attacks, and this happens, and you have that for a minute. But you have only a certain number of those that you can go out and shoot and buff people with.
Sure.
I'm really excited about it, but it feels so much closer to what I wished the alchemist would be like, where it's like, no, I'm concocting, I'm like improvising and coming up with these cool things. It's not a science, it's an art that is just, hey, I'm gonna have fun with this and make a bunch of weird combinations of things.
Sure.
So that was the flavor that I kind of wished had been in the alchemist, but they're going a little bit more towards structure, because structure is easier to implement.
Sure.
Without having, pages and pages of tables.
Yeah, I think they tried that with the wild magic sorcerer and decided, yeah, that's enough.
Whew. Wild magic tables, that's a whole nother topic. I have so many wild magic tables in my folders. I have a 10,000 magic spell effects PDF. I'm like, that's too many, and too many of these will kill the whole party. So
I've never seen a D10,000 before.
Yeah, gotta use digital dice roller. Otherwise, it's just a ball.
Uh-huh.
Well, okay, so with the artificer in mind, our taming of the brew for this week was another artificer thing.
Do we want to go to the cash pot zone, whatever we're calling it?
I think we are close to an hour. That is a very good call, Matthew. All right, well, okay, so before we go talk about our homebrew, we want to talk really quick about the Nerdsmith Network, of which we are both a part of. Nerdsmith.org, we are an entertainment network full of really cool creators making fun, nerdy content, free for you to access. We have podcasts like The Land Above. We have streaming shows like this one and Homebrew Studio coming up today.
And soon to be Shenanigans.
And soon to be streaming with Shenanigans. So we have podcasts, streams that used to be podcasts, and lots of other neat content that you can go check out on nerdsmith.org. If you like what you see here, you can, of course, support us here on Twitch, but you could also subscribe for monthly donations at nerdsmith.org/donate. And all of that money goes to help keeping our lights on here, but directly supporting the creators that make the shows that you enjoy here on our pages. So you guys are awesome. Thank you for continuing to watch us. And if you're new, welcome. We are sponsored by Die Hard Dice. And to that point, Matthew, we have a giveaway to announce today because...
Exciting.
Oh my gosh, we have a giveaway. So through the month of February, we asked you guys to respond to, or not even respond, use the hashtag DiscoverRPG and comment with all sorts of ideas or anecdotes or questions that you might have had for us. And we dove through. We really, really appreciate you guys participating in that. And we randomly chose a winner. The winner is going to get a free set of Die Hard dice of their choice. And that's free shipping, free dice. And we will, let me see. We have our name here. Let me pull it up. Our winner of our February giveaway is Fred Durf at Durfazoid. Fred asked a question with the hashtag. He asked, how do you manage larger player groups, 7 or more players, in terms of all players staying involved and invested and having fun? That is an incredibly good question, Fred. We're still mulling that over. We'll probably do a bigger topic of that in the near future, since we run a West Marches style campaign, and we've been dealing with large groups of people for a while. But Matthew, do you have any opinions on that? Just do you have any experience running bigger groups?
I have never been daring enough to go up that high. I think the biggest group I've ever had was 6, and that only lasted for a couple months before one of the players dropped out. But it can be difficult to juggle that many characters, I think. I don't know how Logan does it with 16 players.
He's got a very high constitution score, that's all I can say. It's at least been in my experience as one of his DM assistants that communication's incredibly important. Setting ground rules so that everybody's on the same page, incredibly important. Mm-hmm. And everybody coming in with correct expectations. For the bigger the group is, the harder it's going to be for people to have spotlight. So making sure that the players are as generous with their time as possible, ready to let people get those spotlight moments when they arise, but making sure they're willing to share. That's a really big part of it. And larger groups are also going to influence the type of story you tell. You're not necessarily going to get those really close character pieces, those very intensely intimate explorations of your PC. You're going to have probably bigger, broader stories of which you are a small part of. So when you start setting that expectation, you're going to have better outcomes, I think. There's a different style of gameplay for anybody, whatever you're looking for. Bigger games are not for everybody. So you just got to figure out what kind of story you want to tell and make sure everybody knows what kind of story you're trying to tell with them. That's at least my little 10-cent soapbox moment on the subject, but we'll get into it a little bit deeper. So thank you, Durfazoid, for your for participating in, and everyone else for participating in our hashtag giveaway. And we will reach out to Fred. I think he might just be on Twitter right now, but we'll reach out to him to get your free Die Hard dice. And for everybody else, since we still love you, thank you all for participating. But if you go to dieharddice.com and you have not yet ordered some amazing metal or polymer dice from Die Hard, you can use the code DRPG and get 15% off your first order. First or next order. Everybody gets to use it once. Please. It's the I don't remember what those are called. Do you remember what those are called?
Burnished, maybe? Rainbow dye?
Oh, they're
Something
so
like
pretty. That. I love it. I've got a set of the
shiny.
darker iron kind.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. It's got a really nice edging. These are the Mythica. I think worn gold, not bronze. It ruined me for plastic dice. Like, it's just so hefty. And not to mention, Die Hard just came out with their Dire D20, which is quite a bit bigger than this one. And you can check those out.
1.5 times the size, I think.
Oh man, I mean, like, talk about making my metal dice feel dinky.
Mm-hmm.
But so yeah, you can go check out on dieharddice.com. DRPG is the code you should use if you're going because of us. Make sure they know that that's where we're coming from, so that they can see that we love them as much as we do. And it's partly so that we can keep track of where their support is coming from. So we'd really appreciate it. And you win by getting 15% off. And our other partner is World Anvil. They are a online world building software to help you track your novel or RPG campaign or anything that you might want to be tracking. Make your own encyclopedic in detail wiki for your characters and lands and objects, anything that might be in your story. We are tremendously big fans, and we really, really love World Anvil. They're going to be sponsoring our WonderCon event at the end of March. We are tremendously thankful for them helping us out with that. So we're going to have lots of cool giveaways from Die Hard and from World Anvil on March 30th at the Anaheim Hilton in the Carmel Room. You can check us out. I'll put the Facebook link up so you can see the event.
Ooh.
So feel free to tell us you're coming. We'd love to see you. But yeah, we have a ton of the creators coming in. Almost the entire cast of Countless will be there. And we're just going to have a lot of fun. And we want to meet as many of you as possible. So if you're in the Anaheim area or you happen to be going to WonderCon, please consider coming with us. And again, that is sponsored by our wonderful partners at World Anvil. So yeah, I think I shilled everybody. It's not shilling. I genuinely like both of our sponsors. They're super awesome people, and they like us enough to share their awesome content and products with us. So, yay.
Yep.
So,
Super.
all right. So let's dive back into the Artificer, specifically a homebrew that I found yesterday. It's called Tools of the Trade. Artificer options. So I will say that Tools of the Trade is from Christopher Waltz, Alex Klippinger, and Christian Acorn. I believe Alex did another homebrew. Yes, Tome of the Pact. That was another homebrew that we had already reviewed, which talked about a bunch of Warlock subclasses and adding some extra detail to the Warlock. Now, so Tools of the Trade is doing the same thing, but for the Artificer. It came out the day, or like a day or two after the Revisited came out, so I assume they've been working on this for a while. It's over on DMs Guild. I put the link in the chat if you want to take a look. From a style standpoint, it's kind of gorgeous. I really appreciate how much time and effort they put into the actual formatting of the document. And they have an interactive one, so I'm a sucker for clickable PDFs. Very easy to navigate. So what do you think, Matt? What do you think, Matthew, about these sort of extra specialties that they've created here?
Some of them I really like. Some of them I'm a little creeped out by.
Golemancer.
The Biomancer, the Golemancer, the Arcane Botanist to a little bit of an extent.
Okay.
But these are very interesting and definitely like vast departures from what you get in just the basic class document. And I like how much flavor has been put into each of them. Personally, my favorite is the Ironclad. Because I've had this idea of creating an artificer subclass that was basically like a suit of power armor for a while, and that's kind of what they do with the Ironclad, and I'm in love with it.
So taking the Arcano armor that is those of you who are familiar with the School of Invention wizard, they also have Arcano armor. I really like the idea of that being a major mechanic of the subclass. Some of these are hitting a little bit closer to that that vibe you were describing before. I think the armor being a focus is a fun variation of the class, but also a really nice departure from a lot of the other normal classes. I thought the way that the Observer was one thing that struck me. The Observer has some interesting flavor in the way that they set it in Forgotten Realms and Eberron. They have in their beginning text for it, giving you the context for what those would actually be used for. It's sort of making almost like a mystical scout rogue, doing some extra things there that. This is a more utility character. You could definitely, it's not necessarily as flashy as some of the other classes, but it's for whatever reason, the flavor reminds me a little bit of almost like a 007 kind of Q vibe to it, where you use your tech and your arcano-mechanical abilities to be an investigator and a collector of information and espionage, which is a fun variant.
It's very much got that spy espionage feel to it, which I like.
You could easily build like a Wetworks assassin out of this too, if you didn't want to necessarily lean into a rogue assassin. You could have a different style. I like the fact that these, in addition to they're Unearthed Arcana, but let's call them canonical. The canonical artificer stuff reminds me a little bit of. I at least personally have the opinion that a cleric, the different cleric domains really lend themselves to vastly different play styles, and this kind of makes me feel that way too. That you could have an entire party of artificers that are doing very, very different things, which I appreciate a lot. I think that allows me to feel like as a DM, when I'm handing this class to somebody, they can definitely find something that they could potentially get very passionate about and could feel special. That's something that I know that players can make a character feel special no matter what their class or no matter what their character is. But sometimes there's something to be said for, you have multiples of the same class in a group, but they just pick different subclasses, but they still feel the same. There's something to be said for subclasses that can really vastly diverge in how the players play and how they feel like they're contributing to the party.
Yes, giving that range of ability and that difference, that uniqueness of flavor, absolutely is great. I also really like some of the stuff they do with the Sapper.
Yeah, I haven't gotten a chance to look through the Sapper. What's their deal?
Well, you have a sort of your homunculus. You have a baneful autonomous machine, or BAM, which
God damn it.
Your BAM lays mines that have different effects, and one of which I particularly love, is called the Blasted Eyes and Ear Shatterer, or BEES. It's basically a flashbang.
Very cool. That's neat. I wish okay, so that style of artificer would be really, really fun in a game that perhaps lent itself more to strategic combat.
Yes, absolutely.
I play so many campaigns or so many games where we end up defaulting to theater of the mind that it can really completely gank a character like that.
Mm-hmm.
But if you play a game where you're using the maps, or your DM is very into letting what you set come to fruition, then yeah, a mind-based artificer would be really, really fun.
Sure.
Especially when they're putting in the context of putting it in. We often talk about adventuring parties sort of being these solo mercenaries, but you put something in the context of like a military unit or a very regimented unit,
Mm-hmm.
then this automatically has a nice niche to fit.
Which I think fits with the Revisited Artificer in particular, because
Mm-hmm.
there's a lot of, I think, it's built more to be like these are combat-ready individuals rather than... you know, the sort of shopkeep feel that the first Artificer had.
Yeah, the first one, I was a little at a loss to feel like I understood what flavor of person they were going for.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't necessarily feel, especially when you compared the alchemist to the gunsmith, it felt difficult to sort of understand what central conceit they were both sharing, that they then broke off into different specializations.
Right.
At least the revised one, like you said, it feels, calling them specialists is a very good way to put it with their subclasses, that these are specialties under a banner of arcane and technological skills merging together. So yeah, I like this view of them being specialists in something, and maybe being a little bit more battle ready, like you said.
Mm-hmm.
Just the very pitch of so the ones that you weren't as keen on, just because they kind of freaked you out a little bit. Golomancer, just from the moment it gave its premise, was a little freaky.
Yeah.
It says specifically, specialists who summon repulsive corpse golems to serve their needs. They're really going for a particular tone there.
Yeah, and it actually ties back into a discussion you were having last week about the ethics of necromancy.
Yeah.
Because sort of the premise here is, oh, it's a tragedy when one of your soldiers falls in battle, but if an enemy soldier falls in battle, hack them up, turn them into a golem, and send them against the enemy. That's perfectly fine.
Yeah. Whew. That's all I gotta say about that.
Uh-huh.
I have become enamored with this idea of reflavoring the dead as spirits of warriors that want to be here. I am really into this Valkyrie reflavor idea, and I really want to kind of lean into it and see if anyone's done it before, or if maybe I just set in my world when you deal with necromancy, that's what you're accessing. Because the barbarian that deals with its ancestral spirits plays really well with that. A wizard necromancer, you could flavor it in that way, and I thought it would be really interesting to do it that way. I've always also wanted to play around with the hobgoblins being sort of like masters of strategy and war, and I was like, okay, well maybe that's a cool way to put a necromancer on the field. Like, it definitely feels a little bit like this is what a hobgoblin would do, instead of the reflavor I want to give them. For some reason, hobgoblins are like Klingons in my brain. Like they're this idea of victory and strategy in war is the way that they establish value for people. The way this is flavored really. It's got to be the right tone of game.
Oh, absolutely.
But I will say this: the existence of this concept does give you a lot of lack of a better word, fodder for enemies, for like a villain character, for establishing. If you thought that this was genuinely this squeaks me out a little bit, you could use this to characterize objectively evil things. They're like, no, they're just using the other side to keep the war machine going. So I don't necessarily think I would be interested in playing this character or necessarily running a game with a character like this, but its existence I value. This is actually an interesting way to approach golomancy and necromancy.
Sure. And I would even say if you are running a campaign where moral ambiguity is kind of one of your key words, even if you don't have like a PC Golemancer, put them in a position where they have to work with a Golemancer, and some of them might morally take offense to that, but it's like this is orders from higher up or something like that.
Oh, yeah. And you have no illusions about the fact that this person's doing very morally questionable work. But much in the case of the evil PC, something is dictating you have to work with them, or there is a higher purpose beyond just the kind of person you perceive them to be. You're like, no,
Sure.
there's bigger fish to fry. We have to work together. And a lot of that might come down to just the charisma of the character. You make a character who's pretty morally reprehensible, but they're charming, you might be able to grease those wheels a little better in terms of your party liking them. So a couple more of these. The Biomancer feels very Witcher to me.
It started to until it got to the biomination part. At that point, I think it's more Hulk.
Oh, okay, I can see that, yeah. It kind of feels a little like, almost like a Jekyll and Hyde kind of thing, too.
I love it, yeah.
If you go with, like, League of Extraordinary Gentlemen Hyde, I suppose, not, like, actual Hyde.
For those of you who aren't actually looking at the PDF, this specialization has an ability called Biomination, which I think is Bio-Abomination sort of fused together.
Biomination.
Yeah. Where basically you guzzle down a bunch of poisonous potions and you turn into this hulking beast. Where, like, your strength goes up, your intelligence goes down, you have this unarmed attack that does D8 damage, and you just turn into this monster, basically. And that's kind of the central ability of the class. And then you can get additional mutations where you can get extra arms or legs or an extra head, and it's some kind of freaky science stuff.
So yeah, if you were going for more of a mad scientist vibe, this would definitely be an interesting way to do it. You're mad scientist, but you also want to like be a crazy melee tank or something. This would definitely be a fun addition, but it definitely leaves you got to be mindful of the body horror implications of playing that particular class.
Oh yeah.
Heart, lungs, and an additional heart, lungs, and liver. So your constitution score goes up. I don't know. I'm amused. It is definitely freaky mad science, but I am amused by it.
Oh yeah, mad science and that's fun.
Yeah, and the last one, the arcane botanist. Come on, play a fantasy poison ivy. How's that not fun?
That is pretty great.
What hit you with it though?
The 14th level ability, Full Nettle Arcanist. Some puns are just a little too far.
Oh, come on, it's good.
No, but it's an interesting class. I do like it's a very poison ivy kind of feel. And yeah, especially that 14th level ability where if you kill a creature, it like gets overgrown with vines and becomes this sort of, natural hazard.
You've created this sort of really dark Sleeping Beauty-esque vinage.
Oh yeah.
Okay, so I'm gonna give them a lot of credit here because I got this exact same vibe with the Tome of the Pact, with the Warlocks. They put a lot of effort into coming up with interesting flavors for these subclasses. I think there are some really neat ideas in here, and some of them incredibly fun mechanically. But I really have to give respect to these guys for coming up with some really fun variations on the Artificer. So any parting thoughts on this? We could always do a binary of, do you recommend people check it out, or
I would recommend that people check it out. I think it has a lot of great ideas. The variety is fantastic, and if nothing else, it, like you said, sparks some really great creative ideas of things to include in your game, even if your players don't go for this specific class or subclass.
Yeah. I put it in chat, but I'll do it again. You can find Tools of the Trade. You can find it on DMs Guild. It's $2.95. I think for how much yeah. Thank you, Logan. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Logan. Your Batman nipple suite will be remembered.
It's the Paladin of Wayne. You must have nipples on your plate armor. But yeah, you can access Tools of the Trade Artificer options on DM's Guild. I put a link if you're interested, and I recommend you check it out. If you're remotely interested in the Artificer Revisited, you should take a look at what some of these subclasses got going for them. They are some very interesting, if nothing else, very, very interesting inspiration points for your world building or characters. So, all right, what do we have next? Timescales. This was something that you had pitched, Matthew, and I'm very curious your thoughts or your preface for this conversation.
Well, I don't even remember what sparked this question, but it was just something I was thinking about, and that is how to deal with timescale and pacing over the course of a campaign. I think it's very curious that if you don't plan out sort of the pacing of a campaign and you're just going day-to-day adventuring with your party, you can have a party that goes from first level to 20th level in 6 months in game time.
Yeah.
Which, if you're in a world that isn't populated with 20th level adventurers, is kind of crazy. And so at that point you have to start asking yourself, okay, should there be a bigger time gap involved in this? Should this be something where, in order to reach that arch-wizard status, that arch-druid status...
a mortal god being, like the druid?
Yeah, basically. You have to spend 20, 30 years in order to work your way up to that? Or is there something in the game world? Is there some reason why these particular characters are advancing so much faster than everyone else around them? And I know there's a bit of a narrative imperative involved here, where these are heroic characters. Heroic characters are defined by the fact that they can do the impossible. But I think there does still need to be a bit of verisimilitude folded into that.
Sure.
And some sort of understanding of why that's the case. I think it's... To pull an example from other media, for example... if you look at Critical Role, that party, the first campaign, Vox Machina, they encountered the sort of the High Arcanist Allura at maybe 5th level, and then knew her through the end of the campaign, at which point they were 20th level, and she was about the same level of power that she had been when they first met her.
Yeah, she was between 10 and 17 or something.
Yeah, I always pictured her about 15th level.
Okay.
Because I don't know that she has 9th level magic. But the fact that, Scanlan can cast Wish, and he's a more powerful arcane user now than she is, and the campaign has only lasted, I think, in-game maybe 3 years?
Yeah. So here's where there are tons of ways for you to approach timescale in that way. I'm off the top of my head, the way that I approach that short time scale of suddenly going from 1st to 20th in a relatively short amount of time, you could approach it like the world, really make heroes incredibly rare, and this idea of being put through the gauntlet is what forces you to have to grow in these abilities. There's no one to train you. You're going through the fire. No one does this. You maybe increase the level of danger that the things you face pose to the world at large. Mm-hmm. People are unable to deal with the kinds of things that you are regularly facing. So one way to approach this is not necessarily that you're spending a ton of time doing this. It's just that nobody's been approached or is capable of handling the level of danger that is regularly coming in your face.
Sure.
It's just this idea of, yeah, like I said, the sort of getting thrown through the gauntlet. That's one way to approach it. I think that's more just justifying how it works right now.
Mm-hmm.
But I love the idea of it's even worse in like the games where you play more real time. With Countless, we've gone through many iterations where we've leveled incredibly fast. Mm-hmm. And even in time, we've leveled incredibly fast. Like, we're dealing in like a 6-month time span right now. And what we've done just logistically is do time skips. Sure. So we've said, all right, a couple months have passed and you've been focusing and you get a level. You get one level over a couple months. And what have you been doing to focus? And I think it was a fairly pivotal level that we were taking the break during. But I think time jumps is a completely legitimate way of approaching it. You just express that there is a level of downtime in which you are trying to focus on specializing in your skill set. That seems like a very common way to do it. Do you have any other thoughts about how to approach time?
I like the idea of time skips. Possibly the best example I've seen of that sort of thing done is there was a multi-session game I played at a convention. This was a few years ago, where it was the same DM and he was running sort of a compressed campaign over 3 sessions. And in the first session, we were level 5 adventurers. And then, you do a break, come back. The second session, we were now level 10 adventurers. But in terms of the storyline, 2 years had passed between the first session and the second session.
Okay.
And then the third session, we were level 15 adventurers, and 5 years had passed between the sessions. And there was this idea of that time having passed, escalating the storyline as well that was being played out over those 3 sessions. Mm-hmm. That's a great way of, in terms of doing it in a compressed fashion, I think was done really well. I really like the idea of taking breaks and giving your characters downtime between adventures. It's something that I'm doing in The Land Above. As soon as we get to the end of the first arc, there's going to be a time skip. And I think that's not only good for spacing things out so that there isn't this ridiculous power ramp up in terms of over the chronology, but also I like the idea of taking those time periods to let players do things outside of adventuring.
Let them feel like whole lives that are being experienced.
Exactly. There's all kind of personal interactions that they can pursue. There's also all kinds of things that are in the Dungeon Master's Guide, and I think they expanded on in Xanathar's maybe even, of downtime activities.
Yeah.
Where they can learn professions, learn proficiencies, and fill out sort of give themselves a more well-rounded character. Mm-hmm. But you have to give them 3 months at a time in order to do that stuff.
Yeah, we did that with Countless before we came back from our last break. We literally went into Xanathar's and was like, "What do you want to do during these few months of break? You're preparing to leave the continent. Mm-hmm. What are you doing before you leave?" So a bunch of people, set up things with their families. My character started an artist commune. It's like, here, you guys can have my workshop. Just don't let it sit and do nothing. Have fun. Mm-hmm. But we each also got to learn a skill to help round out our characters a little bit. And some of them did things like learn languages that we might need to learn on the island. So it gave them the opportunity to feel like they have a little bit more utility in a place that a lot of us would have been struggling to communicate with people. So yeah, I think giving them that downtime to experience the world at large rather than just, we're on the adventure trail. Mm-hmm. What do you kill while you're out there?
I think it also gives time to build a more epic sort of story. Beowulf didn't kill Grendel on Monday and the dragon on Friday. It's this entire story of multiple decades and all of his different adventures. And maybe the adventures are the important focus points that we all look at, but there is that time skip between the adventures where all of this other personal drama is brewing, and these characters are becoming more fleshed out, and they're building connections, and that, I think, just creates a much richer story experience and a much richer world, as opposed to just focusing in on these 5 yahoos as they, pillage and loot across, the landscape.
So, a different game system that plays with time scales really interestingly is the skeletons from Bully Pulpit Games, same people who do Fiasco.
Really? I'm not familiar with this one.
So it is a game of you are the things in a dungeon. You are the monsters and the skeletons and the things that hang out in a eternal dungeon, that you are existing in these large swatches of time of just silence and boredom and nothing happening. And as a DM, you're narrating this idea. Mm-hmm. And what happens is the players have their eyes closed and they're basically meditating, and you don't know how long that meditation is going to last. It could last 30 seconds. It could last 5 minutes. And it's giving the players the experience of what would it feel like to have nothing happening, and then all of a sudden a burst of action and adventurers come into the dungeon. You fight, and then you go back into remission of nothing. And it gives you the other perspective on a dungeon experience that I really want to play it. I've read through the book and it's really fascinating. But yeah, it's variable too. You roll dice to see how long the break is and what happens in the dungeon during those downtimes, during those break moments. It's really neat. You roll to see the time scale of your meditation is the time scale of years versus decades versus centuries. And you just talk. It's almost like a guided meditation with combat interspersed. It's very interesting. I've been meaning to try it. That
sounds like a lot of fun.
Yeah, for certain people, it's going to be super interesting and enriching experience. It's let's not talk all the time. What does it feel like to just be part of this haunted, ancient place that has been here forever and is going to be here long after those adventurers are gone? It's such a good tone. I love it. But I put the link in the chat. And it'll also be on the video description if you want to check out the skeletons. It's a really fun concept of how you can take that setting that is so very commonplace in fantasy games and just kind of force you to experience it from the other side. It's neat. I'm a big proponent of it.
Nice.
So yeah, I think you can do a lot of neat things with timescale. I think the way I'd love to play a game where it's not so much about those little improv moments. It's about crafting a myth together. It's about longer term story.
And I think, I don't know how you do this because I haven't actually read the RPG system, but I'm familiar enough with Pendragon, which is a really old RPG, that has that kind of ethos to it where you're not just playing a single character, you're playing a bloodline. You're crafting a family of honorable knights who you play the descendants of them down the chain, and it's a much greater scale.
I think that would be a really fun idea for a series of one-shots for a group, where you're going to create these little moments in time, this little timeline, and you have committed to playing a bloodline. And so every time you're making a new character, you're playing a different member of that family. I think that would be really interesting. If you had a world you wanted to construct, that would be a really neat way to do it.
Oh, yeah. I hadn't even thought about that, but that's brilliant. That would be a great way of establishing a world.
Yeah, and the players are dictating the larger scale movements that happen because you're talking about cities and empires and just lifetimes passing and what's it going to look like 100 years from now. and what sort of person did your descendants become? I think that's really neat. And if anybody knows of a game like that, please let us know. Use Sims D&D. But yeah, if anybody knows anything, use the hashtag DiscoverRPG or tag us on Twitter at the DiscoverRPG or at DiscoverRPG Show and let us know if you know of it. I'm now curious, and I'll probably go take a look and see if something exists like that. I'm sure it does, because man, lineages are nothing if not a popular fantasy concept.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, that was a really good one. Thank you for suggesting that topic.
Of course.
So we have one more topic. We've been so breezy, despite how in-depth I think we've gotten on a couple of things. So scientific methods. This section is about, well, we kind of talked about it a little bit with the Artificer. The idea of wanting to step away from traditional fantasy tropes and maybe delving a little bit more into what science and technology would have to offer in a setting like Forgotten Realms or any number of fantasy settings, if that's where we're going to sort of start with. I think that I think the Adventure Zone, the Amnesty, or not the Amnesty arc, the Balance arc,
yep.
Did a really fun job in terms of a little bit more. They're with anachronism. It started in a very.
You're turning into a bit of a robot. I don't know if you're having connection issues. And she froze. Well, we're having slight technical difficulties here, ladies and gentlemen. Just a moment while we try and get that figured out. In the meantime, how are you? How are you doing today? You having a good day? I hope so. Post in chat if you're having a good day.
Hey, I'm back.
Hey.
Sorry, my connection completely dropped on me. You talk.
Okay. Balance Arc is an interesting one. I felt like they were still leaning very heavily on magic as opposed to making it sciencey. They did have things like the spaceship, which, but they never got into really this sort of sciencey bit of it. It always felt more magic-y.
Sure. They hinted at it.
Sure. It's always the first question I always think when you're mixing science and magic is how well do they play together? Like, you can have a setting where science and magic combine to make even more spectacular things, or you could have a setting where there's magic and there's science, and they don't really play well together. And those are the settings I always tend to gravitate towards. I don't know why exactly, but my jumping off point is always, if there's a world where people can do magic, then all of the people who can't do magic have science, and they try and use that to keep themselves on the same level as the magic users. So science is sort of this thing that people use to uplift themselves to be on the same level as all of the magic users. That's not necessarily the way you have to play it by any stretch. You can have these sort of syntheses of the two worlds, like the Artificer, where it's a little bit of technology, a little bit of magic working together. And yeah, ultimately, I guess I struggle with the point where you're trying to get to what is a scientific understanding of magic, because that's not something we really have. And if you answer that question down the wrong path, suddenly you have midichlorians, and nobody wants that.
Let me go robot. I'm a little touch and go here.
You are a little bit, yeah.
Darn it. Let me see here. I had two good examples. Let me see if I can get my voice to stop sounding like a beep boop robot. Okay, let's see if it holds.
Okay, you're good.
All right, so I had two examples of the idea of, one, science versus magic, kind of a weird deep cut. There was a pilot for a TV show that never got made. Right on the tail right on the heels of Battlestar Galactica, Ron Moore tried to make a fantasy procedural cop show called the 17th Precinct. And I love this pilot. It's super interesting. You can find it online if you look for it. The special effects are only partially done. But it has a ton of Battlestar Galactica actors in it, and it revolves around a world in which technology never existed and magic took the place of everything. It looks modern, but everything explained with magic.
So you're cutting out a little bit again. So everything looks modern, but there's a magical explanation as opposed to a scientific explanation for how everything got made?
Correct.
Okay.
Like, let me see. Come on. Am I still robot? Or am I okay?
You're
instead of electricity, there's like plant growth that powers everything. Lines on every building, and faxes or like emails basically like magically send information through these vines, and the cops have psychometry illusion magic where we create a crime scene. They can do blood to find out what happened in the forensics. The mortician just the dead. But the conceit of the, since it's never going to be a thing, so I don't mind it, is that they find a death that they can't explain through magic, and they don't understand what's going on, and they find a bullet in somebody. The idea is that there was a cult of science that had technology. Guns were this terrifying thing to do anything about. It was like, that was fun. It buried the lead on it. It just seemed like it was going to be this whimsical, like they have cars, but they don't drive the cars. They're just magic powered.
Sure.
Everything was just sort of a reflavor of a, they didn't have to change that much. They could film in Toronto. They could still have cars everywhere. It didn't matter. Everything just had that slight magical twinge to it, which I really, really enjoyed. But that idea of magic versus science.
Yeah, that's a neat sort of spin on it.
But in terms of seeing magic through a scientific lens, there's a very long fan novel called Harry Potter and the Methods of Rationality. And it's incredibly well written. It feels kind of like an Ender's Game. The premise being Harry Potter was raised by his Aunt Petunia, but his Aunt Petunia married an Oxford professor. Like, never married Fred Dursley because he was a douche, and married this nice Oxford professor. So Harry was immersed in science and logic and philosophy, and when he shows up at Hogwarts, he looks at everything through that lens. And he insists he needs to understand why this stuff works the way it does. It makes Harry a very dynamic, interesting character. But it spins from that. He makes a couple of creative decisions about like certain characters he takes creative license, but for the most part it feels like it rolls from there. Trying to convince Malfoy not to be racist by teaching him about Punnett squares and genetics and how like bloodlines don't work that way and things like that. But taking magic and breaking it down into scientific principles, testing things, figuring out it's not just how it's done, why can I do something different and have the same result? What it was very, very interesting to have him do that, because he had McGonagall comes to Harry to tell him he's a wizard, because of course you'd say McGonagall and not the groundskeeper. He goes, prove that magic exists, and she turns into a cat, and Harry just walks out of his house and says, "Oh my god, mass can be not conserved? What just happened? My world is broken." And so that's the tone of it, and it's a very fun idea of how to look at magic from a rational, scientific basis. Like I said, it's got a lot of Ender's Game vibe to it too, because they do have battle magic, which is very fun. But sorry, I got on those two tangents because what you were saying really reminded me of those two examples.
No, those are great examples.
But let's talk technology in those worlds. So you were talking about the idea of them being opposing forces. That's one way to approach it. I've seen Keith Baker talk about the idea of technology in Eberron, and when he tries to come up with something, the idea that find a technological need and then answer that with magic. What is the magical equivalent of that? But having tech combined with a high fantasy world, you said you lean a little bit, you like the idea of the conflicting forces, that they're not necessarily blended?
That's how I tend to lean towards. I'm not sure if that's just because that's the majority of the media I've been exposed to, that I'm more comfortable with that, because I find it harder to imagine these sort of conflations of magic and science together, or at least understand how they would operate. And I think it's because maybe it's because I'm trying to come at it from a more scientific point of view, which when you start throwing magic into it, everything goes up in the air, and you can just do whatever. Do
you like that whole magic is just science we don't understand yet kind of mantra?
Kind of. But I think that's a different sort of thing, and it kind of goes into the cipher system and Numenera, which I brought up earlier.
Yeah.
Which the cipher system, or the Numenera setting rather, which uses the cipher system of RPG. The Numenera setting is set in the year 10 billion, and it's basically a world in which technology has progressed to the point where it is basically magic. Anything you can do in a fantasy setting with magic can be done with technology. And it's so infused that there are nanite particles throughout the air that respond to the will of certain people. These are the magic user equivalent. So you can create energy bolts, and it's not magic, it's science that's creating them, but it's a magic-like effect. And so that's another way you can do it, is where you have science that's so far advanced that we ourselves couldn't comprehend it, but it creates magic-like effect. So,
yeah, I like that. I think I want to say the League of Peoples by James Allen Gardner talks about a little bit of the idea of nanotechnology imparting what seem to be magical abilities on the populace. I think that's a fun way to sort of sci-fi up a fantasy setting. What about? I've always also liked the idea of integrating the two. That they are separate. Physical properties of the world are still physical properties of the world, and you can change them, of course, if you want to just adjust them for your own means. But then figuring out ways of integrating magic and tech into you could take it as almost a bastardization of it. People feel like it's across the streams, or you find it's just tech is just the natural of people is to just figure out how to do that, especially magic is not as common. But then people figure out how to incorporate those. You have mechanical golems and stuff where it's no, this thing is this could run on its own if we chose to, but magic was a way of augmenting what already existed as a mechanical construct.
Right.
I think that I mean, obviously some people like their fantasy, like to separate the vegetables on their plate. They don't don't like them to touch. I think that there's no reason to not pull everything you can when you're building worlds. I think it allows you to play with different flavors in your overarching story. You can have something perhaps that is a bit more high fantasy with more magic being very pervasive, but then you could also go to some place where magic is not as pervasive and technology is just the primary means, and you're just weird. You're like these weird magicians that came into town, and you don't fit in the same way that you did where you came from.
Sure.
I think it would be fun to play with a world that has maybe geographic limitations on magic. And so you come from a high fantasy location, this kingdom, and everyone's just like, man, these guys are just whimsical and weird, and they can bring the dead back to life. They're like a bunch of freaks. This is weird. and you're existing in a more mundane place, or you interact with a lot more people that are more mundane.
Sure, and I think that goes to... I can never remember the terms quite right, but there's like hard magic systems and loose magic systems, and how you define the way magic can be done in a particular world.
Sure.
Like,
yeah.
Some worlds have very structured, defined rules of this is how magic is done, and this is what you have to do to produce magic, and others are very sort of loosey-goosey and sort of, hey, you can do whatever you want kind of thing. So
yeah. Do you have a preference?
It depends. It really depends on the setting and the kind of story that I'm trying to tell, because both have their uses. Something I just realized, and I might be the last person on the train here, but I never realized Ghostbusters was a sci fantasy setting until just now.
Oh yeah, sure. Yeah, it's a supernatural fantasy and science mixed together. Yeah, that's a cool one. Yeah, so you could also come up with a situation where the supernatural exists. Maybe the supernatural is a new phenomenon in your setting. So you have people that are limited by more mundane abilities, and you're suddenly having to deal with the supernatural. That is, I mean, that might not fit as easily in say a D&D setting, because there's only so many classes that would be considered magic light.
Sure. That's kind of I think the conceit of Shadowrun.
Yeah, sure.
If I remember correctly, where it was a very sort of normal contemporary world, and then suddenly magic entered into it, and people started turning into orcs and trolls and elves and...
Yeah. Oh gosh, that just makes me think of that Netflix show. Oh man.
Oh, Bright?
Yeah. Premise was so promising, then every detail about it made me go, I'm good.
Yeah,
pretty
unfortunately.
Good. Highly recommend Lindsay Ellis's analysis of that movie.
Oh, I'm not sure if I've seen her video on it or not. I'll have to go look if I haven't seen it and watch it, because
let me think. What other things can we talk about in terms of using science in... So the idea that they're opposing forces, I think a lot of times, especially if you look at things like the way that a lot of people interpret Lord of the Rings, that's magic versus technology, but technology inherently ruins nature. That's sort of the morality of what they're dealing with. Have you ever thought about the flip side? That justifying magic as being the almost abomination kind of force in the world, where technology and reason are sort of the warden holding it back?
You could definitely do that. I know there are certain settings like Dark Sun where magic is a very destructive thing. I'm not sure how familiar you are with Dark Sun. I've
only heard of it. I haven't actually encountered it.
I have sort of a surface level understanding, and basically, in that setting, in order to do magic, you have to draw life force out of other things. So, because magic was at one time so pervasive, it basically killed the entire planet. All of the life force has been sucked out of it. So there are settings like that where magic is, yes, very destructive, and coming up with alternative means to run a civilization would be very important. I think in that case, I don't know. It's an interesting jumping off point, because then what happens if you have like a sorcerer in your party, someone who's born with magical abilities, who didn't choose to do this, but they have these magical abilities which are inherently destructive, and then it almost becomes more like an X-Men situation.
Yeah,
where you have people born with abilities that might not necessarily be good if they ever use them. So yeah, that's an interesting idea.
There's lots of story ways to jump off from that about having. I mean, there's storyline potential for that sort of sorcerer. The idea that maybe you come from a strong bloodline that maybe has some problematic historic implications.
Sure.
Yeah, no, I'm curious about the idea of a world that is recovering from magic.
Mm-hmm.
And it's either slowly coming back, or just long enough, a lifetime passed, or a couple lifetimes passed before magic came back. Ooh, what about like a Game of Thronesy kind of the way that the seasons work, where there's eras of magic and then eras of mundane, where some people were raised in the era of magic where that used to be a thing, but then it's gone. There's no explanation for why it left. People just had to suddenly deal with the fact that they had lost. You've got like tyrants who ruled with an iron fist because they had otherworldly magical abilities, and then all of a sudden they're gone. And do you have uprisings? Do you have people doubling down on like military action because they don't have the magic to back up their power anymore? That would be really interesting. That's certainly an interesting way to deal with the that long form game of dynasties, of bloodlines. You could say you live in a world in which magic and the mundane are constantly fighting each other for supremacy in just the physical world. What's the dominant force? And your bloodlines shift whether they're exposed to that or not.
And I think possibly an interesting idea to tie into that is something that's always kind of bugged me about fantasy settings, where we live in a medieval world that's lasted for 10,000 years. Why have you never advanced beyond that? Given that, we have gotten from there to here in just about 700 years.
To me, that feels like then there's some social force that is keeping innovation down, or keeping people complacent.
And maybe that's just the presence of magic. So as you have these seasons, when magic fades, suddenly technological innovation spikes. And then magic comes back and it plateaus, and then you have. So
you've got gunslingers running around sometimes that are like, oh, that old mastery of explosions in your hand. Are you crazy? And then the idea of magic coming into play and it being an ancient art at some point. And yeah, that would be so interesting to deal with on the macro scale. The cultural implications of that shift. Yeah, oh man, this is one of those things that I'm sure exists in some world building scenario, but man, am I not intrigued by the implications of it in a role play setting. Either one, honestly, either era would be really interesting to play through. That you have, so on the side of everything is mundane right now. Oh, yes, Zach, that is what's happening in Song of Ice and Fire, except I was removing the seasonal aspect and maybe having it be a bit more abrupt rather than, as the generation passes, magic is slowly re-entering the world. It's just a wave hits and all of a sudden there's magical abilities, or a generation hits and all of a sudden those children are developing magical abilities. How do you deal with the fact you have a bunch of toddlers running around that might have innate magic in them? And
there aren't any older magic users to teach them how to use their powers. Like,
oh god, where's the library? I need to find that Babysitting for Wizards book that was somewhere in the library. Yeah, no, I'm really digging this idea. It's definitely worth exploring a little more. I'm sure I'll have it digging in my brain for a while.
Sure.
Let's see. So we've got 5 minutes left. Chat, if you have any questions, throw questions. I'll see if I have a backup question or something. Sorry, my husband's been playing Dark Souls. I have onion night noises in my head whenever I think too much. Let's see. I was gonna bring something up before. Which Batman is best Batman? Okay, Logan. I mean, there's something iconic and everlasting about nipple Batman.
Which nipple Batman? Kilmer or Clooney?
Kilmer. George Clooney never... Okay, George Clooney struck me as a good Bruce Wayne, but he never struck me as a good Batman. At least Val Kilmer kind of did both a little. I'd rather have someone who does both pretty well than one completely unconvincingly.
I always liked Keaton's, but Lego Batman has a special place in my heart now.
That's a good one. I actually really dig the animated Justice League Batman. Personally, because I'm a Batman Wonder Woman shipper. So the idea that they've played with that for a lot in the series, especially when they were turned into children and Wonder Woman was just taller than all the boys. It was pretty good. And they took the piss out of him all the time, which was great. They're like, listen, he's really grumpy. None of us are this grumpy. And they introduced the idea of Batman having fail-safes for everybody. They had that aspect of him in that cartoon series, which I really liked.
Yep.
And the fact that Wonder Woman didn't have one. He's like, this is why she's dangerous. I don't have a thing in a box for... Hello, Whiskey. Thank you for joining us.
Hey, puppy.
One day we're going to have Puppo Cam, but it's a lot of tech setup.
Understandable.
Who would you like to see as a guest on Discover RPG? That's, again, Logan's question. I think he's just trolling for ideas.
Matt Colville, if you could get him.
Matt Colville would be interesting. I'd love to get... we haven't had any ladies on the show yet. I'd like to get some... Honestly, I'd love like Amy Vorpal or...
Would be good.
Yeah. I'm trying to think of who else would be really interesting to have. I have a list. Darn it. I have a whole list of them. But yeah, I think Amy Vorpal would be really fun to have. People who've played in different systems, who are especially known for different systems other than D&D, just to pick their brain.
Wow, I'm failing right now.
Putting us on the spot like this, Logan.
Yeah. Deborah Ann Wall, if you could get her.
Oh yeah, that'd be good. She'd be awesome. As someone who is a relatively, I don't want to call her a newer DM, but she's been at least in the public sphere relatively new, introduced to the into the hobby. You can really tell with her how passionate she is about it, which is really fun. When you can see that on somebody's face, it's really delightful. She gets huge kicks out of what she does. Yeah, we have lists. Someone I would love to get on that I have on like my actual list of people I want to get on is Dale Kingsmill, who runs the Monarchs Factory YouTube channel. She's from Australia, so we'd have to figure out the time zone thing. But she does a lot of really neat homebrew stuff or really deep analysis of different elements of world building. Her Thieves Camp video is amazing. We talked about it last week. About different ways to incorporate Thieves Camp into your world building. Not just you speak, Thieves can't.
Right.
Actual games and how to interpret Thieves Camp into a functional interaction that you can have with someone, not just in language, but in code. How you dress importing information to people, playing street games, and those street games impart information to people. Turning Thieves Camp into more of a system of verbal and non-verbal communication. I think that's something that if you're interested in how people communicate, that can be a really potent way of making your rogue feel more vital to more than just I stab in the dark.
Right.
So I really love the idea of figuring out how to get classes to feel like they have more utility than just combat or just out of combat, figuring out how they can help move the story forward in interesting ways. I'm a big fan of trying to elevate players into feeling they get that important spotlight moment.
Here's a suggestion. Victoria Rogers. She's the DM for the Broadswords.
Okay. Yeah. I'll put her on the list. Good call. So we have a list, and if you know of anybody, audience and chat, that you would like to see on the show, like Susanna Grace or Satine Phoenix, they're also very, very fun DMs to ask. Marisha Ray. We will put them on a list of people we're gonna reach out to and be like, hey, be our friend, come hang out with us. We've really lucked out so far with the wonderful people we've had guesting on the show before, such as Matthew Seibert, as we have reached the end of our time together, and the Mr. Rogers music is playing in the back of my head, and I'm slowly putting on my shoes and my cardigan. Thank you so much, Matthew, for joining us. It was really wonderful.
Thank you for having me. It's been a great pleasure.
Just in case anybody's here that wasn't here at the beginning of the show, what do you have to plug? Or what would you like to let people know they can find you or see you in?
Of course. I am the Dungeon Master of the Land Above podcast. You can find that here on the Nerdsmith Network by going to nerdsmith.org. We are a Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition adventure storytelling podcast. And which involves a group of non-human, monstrous PCs in a subterranean, underground, Underdark-like setting. And we are about halfway through our first arc in terms of what's been published. And we're going to go to some very emotional and getting into kind of dark places with what's left before this arc ends. So if you're interested in sort of darker themed, non-standard D&D campaigns, definitely give us a listen. That's the Land Above podcast. I am also, as of tonight, in just a few hours, going to be hosting a streaming show on this very network called The Homebrew Studio, in which I work with chat and we create interesting, unique homebrew creations for your RPG games.
Have I told you that my brain just hears the pop-up video theme song whenever I hear your show?
You have. Yeah.
It still happens rote. Like
Homebrew Studio.
Yep, exactly. We need to make you an intro.
But yeah, it's going to be at 5 p.m. Pacific time every Wednesday starting tonight, so just a few hours from now. And I think that's it as far as me. You can follow me at Twitter at the address here too below my face. And that's it.
Awesome. I will put your Twitter in there too. We have links. Check out Homebrew Studio tonight on Discover. We Are Nerdsmith's Twitch channel, where you are right now. And I think we are complete. We have achieved the whole session plan, and I'm very proud of us. All right, everybody. Thank you all so much for joining us for this episode of Discover RPG. We hope that you will come check us out next week. Logan, perhaps and you pleasure. So, joining us. You're awesome. Thank you all, everybody. Please do me a favor and have a wonderful week. And Logan's gonna off the stream.
Nice. Thank you, Robot Angela. Bye, everybody.